All right, welcome, Mike. Nice to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Cool. All right, so today we're going to be talking about cool new updates for. So it's AppCAT, I guess, is the short name, right? What?
Yeah. So the official name of what we're talking about today is the Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment Tool. But
Nice.
that's a mouthful. It's long as we want to include that it's under the Azure Migrate umbrella conceptually, but it's for assessing your code at the application level. So the name got really long, but sometimes
Yeah.
you'll see it referred to as AppCAT for short. That's app from application, then the CAT for code assessment tool.
Awesome. Okay, and I've already seen a sneak peek of the demos you're going to be showing, which I'm very excited about. So very cool. Let
Yeah.
me start by. I'll start with the community links as we always do. Not a whole bunch today. Um, the first one we've got from Vincent talking about Fluent for Blazor. So this is really cool. The Fluent UI Blazor library. The place that I've seen it used the most lately is on the Aspire dashboard, which is really really cool. So here, this is hopefully the beginning of a series. So Vincent starts by talking about what FAST is. It's a set of it's a collection of technologies built on web components, modern web standards, which is really neat. There's so many things that browsers can do that is just built in that we don't really leverage, day to day. And I feel like a lot of web front end libraries like create a lot of things that kind of duplicate some things that are actually built in. So Fast is this neat thing built on web components, and then Fluent is a design language library kind of built on top of that. Hopefully, I said this mostly right. And then the Fluent UI library for Blazor is level on top of that. So if you're building applications, especially things that can benefit from a component library, Fluent UI is pretty awesome. And so Vincent explains kind of how this interacts with Blazor. Blazor, of course, can work with any HTML and CSS, so it seems kind of a natural thing to kind of plug them together. The website, the Fluent UI Blazor website, actually has a bunch of live demos, which is pretty neat. So for any of these, you can go through and you can see interactive stuff. So for instance, you can see some of these, and you can interact directly with them, which is pretty neat. So I don't know, just playing around with these, but there's all these different ones. So if you're building, especially like dashboards or business applications, things like that can benefit from components, it's a pretty cool setup. And then he shows off here the Blazor sortable library, which I was happy to be a very, very tiny part of. Burke Holland and I built kind of a thing that ended up being a bit of a prototype for this, and then they built this out. So officially shipping in the Fluent UI Fluent for Blazor library. I'm sure I said that completely wrong. And neat picture of dashboard support. So we're definitely going to have to get Vincent on to go more in detail on this. So Andrew Locke has been doing a series here. Last week we looked at name pipe support in .NET 8, and here's talking about Unix domain sockets. So he starts by explaining kind of what they are. What's neat about these is they're for local interprocess communication on the same host, very similar to IP based, but it's faster and simpler because it is on the same machine. So you don't have to do all the TCP IP negotiation stuff and all that. So I'm enjoying this series to be able to kind of learn some of these protocols I wasn't completely aware of. So it's neat here. You kind of specify them as a file name. So he explains that .sock or .socket is a kind of a standard format for these, but it's basically any file path you can use. And then you can do neat things like, for instance, you can check for file support. You can use kind of a known path and check if it exists. So that sort of thing. So like for instance here he's saying like you can do a quick file exists to check if that domain socket is set up. I breezed over this at the beginning. It's called Unix domain support, but it's actually supported in Windows now as well. So that's kind of cool. Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019. So anyways, then he goes through and shows the different ways you can set it up. One is you can say listen Unix socket, or the other is you can do a URL path that uses Unix colon as I forget what the protocol. So anyways, some examples here showing that, and pretty simple. Here he did listen Unix socket, and it's listening on the socket. So just magic. And then you can also define a URL, and it'll just figure that out and bind to that. So very cool stuff. So anyways, like the series. This one's cool from Ian Griffiths at Engine, explaining. This is something I don't know, Mike. I've definitely run into this. Parsing JSON.
Yeah.
JSON is something where it either works or it doesn't. So, and I ran into this just a couple of weeks ago. There was an API another team provided us, and it was malformed JSON, and I had to end up doing string replace on it before I could parse it because it was just wrong. So, and the way that the system text JSON does a lot of the time, it's high performance, but if something goes wrong, you just get an exception. So this is kind of he goes into a bit of depth in the blog post, but he explains here, something like if I'm expecting an integer ID, and then what happens if I get here, it's not an integer, it's 3.14159, right? So this is going to be a parse error. And then he shows also other cases where you have something like here it's actually is an integer, but is quoted as a string. So there's all kinds of different things that can go wrong. And most of the time you're going to end up with an exception and a lot of error checking and stuff. So he's explaining in here this, try parse pattern is throwing this exception. And then they've got a library he's going to link to in a bit here. And it's a bit of a scroll, but he's got a library that he points out and talks about, like here where you can basically use a schema validation on JSON instead. So this library is his Corvus schema. I'm definitely interested in taking a look at that. So. And then the last one I've got to share is just this cool looking EF Core visualizer. So this is really neat. It's a Visual Studio extension, and it shows off neat things like it'll show your query plan visualizer, works with Postgres as well. So I don't know. I just love these extensions. Makes it a little more fun. So that's all I got. So the links, let me share those links in the, I'll share them in the comments here. And did that go or did not go? Try it again. Cool. And I'm ready to turn it over to you, Mike.
Yeah, sounds great. All right, cool. So I've got a few slides. If we can get share my screen, there we go. Yeah, so I'll just jump right in. Got a couple slides. Most of this is going to be just a demo, then have some time for questions at the end.
Awesome.
But yeah, like John was saying, I'm going to be talking today about the Azure Migrate application and code assessment tool, which is, as it says here, this is a static analysis tool. We've got a .NET and a Java version. Today, I'm going to talk about the .NET version, of course, because that's the stand-up we're in. But know that if you work with Java as well, we have a Java version out there that you can go check out, and it works very similarly. But the idea of the Azure Migrate application and code assessment tool is that it's a static analysis tool that allows you to scan at the source code level through your solution, identifying code patterns, API usage, config file contents, things like that, that may be problematic when you move into an Azure PaaS environment like Azure App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, or Azure Container Apps. The idea is that if you have an existing on-premise web app today and you'd like to move it into Azure, using AppCAT is a quick and easy way to sort of see if there's any red flags, see what sort of work you have ahead of you so that you know what you're getting into and you can plan it out. The tool is free and very easy to get started with. Um, so I've got a couple links here. If down at the bottom in particular, that aka.ms/appcat is the best place to get started. That's going to take you out to our documentation where it'll explain how to install the tool, how to run it, and so on. But yeah, let's kind of go through a little bit about what benefits you get from it, and then we'll do the demo. So I like to talk a little bit about where the AppCat tool fits in the overall app modernization and migration workflow, because there's a lot that happens here. When people talk about modernization, sometimes they talk about the 5 or 6 R's of modernization, where there's different there's different ways you might approach an individual application to prepare it for the future. And I've got one list of 6Rs listed here. Depending on who you ask, you get different names for a lot of these, but there's this range of saying, well, you might just do nothing with your app and say, no, it's too hard to move out of our data center, to rehosting, where you take it, you pick it up and drop the entire thing into a VM. This is sort of like an IaaS migration, to something like a replatform, where you are taking advantage of platform as a service offerings in the cloud, but you're making sort of the minimal code changes you need to get there, down to the more invasive things like re-architecting, rewriting, or maybe just finding a SaaS solution that you can purchase instead, or just deciding you don't need the app at all. And when we talk about a tool like Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment, we're really focused on this replatform bucket of apps, which makes it a little bit different from some of our other Azure Migrate tooling. So if you've used Azure Migrate itself before, it's more focused on the rehost part. Of course, it kind of has features for all of these, but it's primarily about understanding your infrastructure, things like that. Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment is a new tool under the Azure Migrate umbrella that now gives us the ability to really dive into the replatform scenario, where you have this on-prem app. You're willing to make some code changes, but you'd like to keep them as small as possible in order to get the app functional in AKS, app service, whatever. So when we think about the sorts of issues that are going to be found, here's an example of some of the types of things that will get flagged. This is not a complete list, but it gives you sort of a sense of the kinds of things that we're going to be looking for when we execute the AppCat tool. And they basically fall into just a few categories. First, we're going to look for any external dependencies. This is one of the biggest challenges people have when they take an existing app from their data center and move it into something like Azure App Service. Apps frequently connect to a database. They depend on some sort of network file share. Maybe they read or write to files outside of the application's root. Maybe they make HTTP requests to other apps that exist on the local network. All of these are things that aren't going to immediately work when you pick your app up and move it into a new environment. So you need to be aware of them so that you can have a plan in place. Maybe you need to migrate your data at the same time as migrating your app, or maybe you need to figure out a solution using something like ExpressRoute to connect your Azure resources back to on-prem. And so one of the big things we look for is any sort of external dependency, so that you can review it, make sure that it's going to continue working after you're done with the replatforming. The other thing we'll look for is anything authentication related, because typically when you take an existing application, move it from your data center up into Azure, you want to revisit how auth works. Sometimes it keeps working the same, but often there are differences. If you're using Windows authentication to authenticate your users, or even to authenticate with your app's dependencies, you want to revisit that. Use something like Microsoft Entra ID to have your users authenticate. Maybe when you're authenticating with your app's dependencies, you use managed identity in the cloud as a simple and secure way to do that. So we identify all of these auth related dependencies in your application. The third thing that we look for is any dependency that would impact the ability for the application to scale. If you have in-proc session state, if you have in-memory caching, things like that work fine when your application is just deployed on one IIS server sitting in your data center. But when you take that same application and you run it in Azure App Service, or even more so in something Kubernetes based like AKS or ACA, Now there's a lot of potential in the cloud to very easily scale in and out dynamically so that you're only paying for the resources you need. And when demand is high, you scale out. When demand is low, you scale in. But that's only going to work if your application is architected in such a way that it's able to dynamically add and remove instances. So this in-process state can be an impediment to that. So we always make sure to identify things like caching and session state that aren't externalized as potential issues. Yeah, I see in the chat, auto scaling is auto scaling my spending, but it's also auto scaling your spending down, which is which is the thing that's really good about it. And yeah, sometimes it scales
Yeah.
your spending up, but only in the situations where you needed that capacity to provide service to your users.
Yeah, that's a big point. That it's scaling down. It's important to make sure you got it set up right, but it can
Yeah.
actually save you a lot of money.
Yes.
I mean, before working at Microsoft, I worked at a financial company, and when we scaled by buying huge servers,
Yeah.
and you never get that money back, right? You just
Yeah.
spend the money. Whereas, like, if you have auto scale that can scale down, you're paying for what you're using. So
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And so one of the things we look for with AppCAT is trying to make sure that we can identify anything that would prevent that from working in your app. And then the last category of things we look for would be opportunities for you to take advantage of new features now that you're running in Azure. So the big example of this would be how you manage secrets. So if we look at your application and we see that you have a web config file with connection strings in it, well, that's not going to be a blocking issue. That's going to work fine when you're running an app service. We load the web config, we get the connection string, off we go. But because you're now running in Azure, there are better ways of solving that problem. You can use something like Azure Key Vault to securely store secrets. You can use Azure App Configuration to store the less sensitive config values that might need to be shared or updated dynamically in the cloud. And so we identify some things like that as well that are opportunities for improvements. And then these last two, non-HTTP protocols and application request routing, are examples of situations where the app service sandbox might change the way things work. So we identify things that are specific to app service, AKS, or Azure Container Apps that might impact your application. As we do that, we've got a variety of severities that we assign to the application, to the issues that are identified, to indicate whether it's something that is likely going to be an issue or if it's just something you need to review. And when we go through the demo, you're going to see that most of the issues identified fall into this potential category, because these are things that they're not necessarily an issue, but it's something that's important for a developer who's familiar with the application to review before you move forward. And so that's going to be a lot of these, but we also do have the mandatory items, the optional items, and in some cases we'll have informational, which is something worth calling out that doesn't require any action on the developer's part. So I want to dive in and kind of go through what this looks like, so that you can really see it firsthand. So here we have a sample application that it's one of our older versions of the eShop sample. We have a new eShop now that showcases Aspire and some of our new technologies, but this is an old one because it has a lot more things that show up as interesting in the AppCAT report than if I use the new version. So I've got an old version of eShop. It's an ASP.NET .NET framework application. It's a simple e-commerce example. Most of the code is in this MVC web app, and then there's a couple small helper libraries that go along with it. So something I should have mentioned earlier, but when you run AppCAT, there's actually two different ways of running the tool when you're assessing your .NET apps. There's a Visual Studio extension, and there's a command line tool. The command line tool is a .NET SDK tool, so it's very easy to install. If we have time, I'll go through both of those today. But I want to start with the Visual Studio one because it gives the best experience, because being inside of VS, we're able to sort of interactively walk you through a few different processes, which you'll see as we go through this experience. So if you were brand new to using AppCAT, you would start by installing the extension. You'd go to Manage Extensions in Visual Studio. And in my case, I already have it installed. So if I go over to the installed extensions, you can see we have Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment. You could browse it, install it here. You also could go out to the VS Marketplace and search for it. I also have the GitHub Copilot Chat extension installed, which is worth pointing out because if you have both of these, there's some integration between them that's kind of nice to have. Copilot Chat's not required, but you're going to see some cool functionality light up because I have it available.
Can I ask a real quick question
yeah,
here?
please, absolutely, jump in.
Okay. So for somebody that's not using Azure, obviously this is very Azure focused,
Mhm.
but I could see this being potentially useful even other, like if I'm looking at how can I scale my application or how can I
Yeah.
move to containers or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Okay. All
Yes.
right.
Yeah. So we designed the rules, thinking about Azure because that's the scenario we were trying to enable. But there's no reason you couldn't apply this to other scenarios like you're talking about, whether that's, uh, you know, moving into a more general containerized environment or just thinking about running someplace other than your data center, whatever that looks like, there's still value. It is focused though on the re-platform scenario where you're taking the app, you're making minimal changes and running it in a new environment. If you're looking for something where you're actually going to be upgrading your app, let's say I want to take this eShop and I want to move it to ASP.NET Core. For that, we have a
Mhm.
different tool which is called Upgrade Assistant, and you would use
Yeah.
that one for that scenario.
Cool.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So once we've got the extension installed, using it is as easy as right-clicking in the Solution Explorer and then choosing this new Replatform to Azure menu option here. So we choose this, we get this sort of welcome page for the AppCAT extension. And now we're going to create a new report. It's going to show us what we need to do. Now, I should point out one of the reasons I really wanted to get on and share about this today was because we have a new version of AppCat for .NET coming out this week, and so I'm going to be showcasing some of those new features. So if you download this tool today, you won't have all of these features, but if you download it later in the week, they'll all be there, and you can of course just go and update the extension. But the tool was released originally or in January, and so it's been out a few, like maybe a month and a half, but it's still relatively new. So I imagine a lot of folks aren't familiar with it. So I'm going to go through the whole experience of using it. But along the way, I'll point out a few things that are new that are coming later this week, which I'm super excited about. So the first new feature is this one where you get the option now to choose which Azure environment you would like to run on. Previously, if you use the released version of AppCat, it just does an assessment for a general Azure target, highlighting the most common issues. But there are differences if you're going to be running an app service versus if you're going to be running an AKS, for example. And so we have the ability now for users to choose which environment they intend to run in. And based on what they choose, we still run all of the same rules, but we will adjust the severities and the descriptions of some of the rules to match that environment so that you get a report that's tailored specifically to where you intend to be executing your application. Now, if you
Yeah.
don't know where you want to end up, or if, like in your case, John, if you're just looking for sort of a general, hey, I'm moving this thing, what do I need to think about report? There's this any option up at the top. So I'll just choose
Oh,
app service Linux sort of arbitrarily, but whichever one made sense for your scenario, you would select. On the next page now, we choose which projects in our solution we want to analyze. So you're going to want to choose like all of your top level web apps. You don't need to choose their dependencies because the tool will automatically assess any projects which the selected ones have project to project dependencies on. So by just choosing eShop Legacy MVC, that's good enough. It pulls in common and utilities automatically. We're then asked if we want to analyze just our source code or also binary dependencies that are identified. So a binary dependency would be like a NuGet package or a third-party DLL or something out of the GAC. So if I select both of these, then we'll analyze our source code. We'll also go look at the IL of those binary dependencies, and we'll assess that as well. So if you select both, you're going to get the most complete picture in your report, but you will also get a lot of noise. So I usually recommend that people start with just their own source code because it's going to be the highest priority issues and the ones they have the most control over. But then if you want to get a more complete picture, it can also be useful to run a second scan with both boxes checked. We also have a more advanced feature down here, which is this bottom portion of this pane is new this week. This is the ability to provide a config file that customizes the way the rules work. So I'm going to come back to this one a little later because it deserves its own really focused discussion. But in short, it's going to allow us to sort of adjust which rules are considered important or unimportant, and even define our own rules for what we want to be looking for. But again, that's kind of a more advanced feature. So you typically wouldn't start there, but it's something you can come back to later. And then with all of those those choices made, we click Analyze. The tool goes, it runs. This sample app is very small, so it goes very quick. But even on a very large real-world application, the tool shouldn't take more than a minute or two to do the assessment. So it's relatively quick. And then what we get when we're done is we get this dashboard showing a summary of the items that were identified. So it tells us that it assessed 3 projects. It found 14 different kinds of issues with 36 total incidents between them. We get a little pie chart here showing the graph of the different severities. I already talked about how these 9 mandatory issues represent the ones that the tool has high confidence will need some sort of code change to work well in Azure, whereas the bulk of them are going to be these potential ones where it's, hey, you've got this dependency. A developer needs to go look and just confirm whether that's going to be available or not from Azure. That sort of thing is what we're going to find in this potential group. And then there's a couple optional issues where nothing blocking, but we have an opportunity to improve something about our application, whether it's security, reliability, whatever, by taking advantage of new Azure functionality. The other thing I want to point out that's really cool is in the new version of AppCAT that's releasing this week, we have an open chat button. And this is the first part of that Copilot chat integration I was talking about. If you have both the AppCAT extension and the GitHub Copilot chat extension installed in Visual Studio, you're going to have the option to click open chat, and that will start a new conversation thread with Copilot. It will share the contents of the AppCAT report and ask Copilot to summarize what issues are most important and guide you on how you need to go and address those. And then you have a conversation with Copilot where it's able to help you take the next steps after reviewing the report. So for example, here it's telling me, okay, welcome to the Azure Migration Assistant. We see that there's issues related to database dependencies, file IO operations, the way that I'm logging, and then some miscellaneous other issues. And it says, I'm going to guide you through this. Where do you want to start? And so even if you're brand new to Azure, you can just pick a place and say, oh, let's start with logging, for example. And now Copilot Chat is going to help me walk through those issues and figure out what needs to happen to address them in an interactive way. Again, this is
Wow.
optional. If you don't have
Yeah.
Copilot Chat installed, you'll just have sort of a message here saying, hey, just so you know, you can get Copilot Chat. But if you've got it, you get this really cool interactive experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool that what my as I'm learning more and more about AI, the more kind of information and context you can provide, the better. So
Yeah.
this is such a great use because you can basically, it's now a system expert on your code and your migration because you provided all that context over to it.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yes. And so here we go. It's coming back. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast. It's kind of random, but it says, okay, we're going to start with logging. And so it says it sees we see where you're using log4net. It gets that out of the AppCAT report.
Mhm.
It's asking me to share my log4net config file. So when I share that, it'll then look through and say, okay, here's what we need to change related to logging, and it'll guide me through it. All right.
Wow.
So then we also have this concept of story points I wanted to touch on briefly. And this is just a unitless measure of effort that we estimate it's going to take to get these applications working in the cloud. Now, this doesn't correspond to some number of hours or days or even whatever it is that your team means when they say 102 story points. It's just a way of comparing things relatively. So when I go look at my issues grouped by project, I can see, oh, there's 96 story points worth of effort for the web app. There's 3 story points worth of effort for each of the small helper libraries. So that tells me the bulk of my time is going to be working on the eShop Legacy MVC project. That's the way to reason about these story points. But then from this page, I can now jump in to look at individual projects. I'll get a dashboard specific to that, scope to that project, and I can look at the issues either by component, which since I scanned source is going to be each of my source files, or I can look at the issues sort of grouped by type. We also have an aggregate issues pane that's going to show across my whole solution all of the issues that were detected grouped by the type of issue that it is. So here, for example, we see here's the different types of issues, and I can expand these to see additional details about them. Here we see the individual incidents, and then on the right, we see a summary of what the issue is about. So here, for example, it says I'm using MSMQ. and that's likely not going to work in Azure App Service. So this is considered a mandatory issue to address. And there's an explanation that we can use Azure-based queuing services like Azure Storage Queues, Azure Service Bus, as a more cloud-native alternative to doing this sort of messaging that my app's doing. We also include here a code snippet from my solution showing where the MSMQ dependency is happening. And over here, we get the specific location and source, and it's even hyperlinked, so I can click this and go take a look at where it's happening in code. And yep, sure enough, I am creating a new MSMQ message and I'm sending it to a queue. If I sort of look at where that's happening, it's when we're creating a new item in our product catalog. So there must be some functionality here inside of my eShop sample where when something new is added to the product catalog, we queue up a message so that other applications in my environment can respond to that addition. So obviously this is something that's going to have to change when we move to the cloud, and it's going to have to be, okay, now we're going to put those messages in, say, an Azure storage queue or a service bus queue.
Okay.
And so as before, we also have like the links down here to docs as well. But as with the dashboard, we also have an Ask Copilot button for each of these individual issues so that you can get targeted guidance on each of these issues if there's one that you'd like to learn more about or get Copilot's opinion on how to address. So I clicked Ask Copilot. So I'm now getting a new conversation thread specifically about this. And so when I click that button, we're going to take everything in this pane. So it's going to get the description of the issue. It's going to get the source code snippet, though not the whole file. And it's going to get some additional prompting from AppCAT that it's going to use to now guide me through what to do. You do want to be aware that using Copilot here shares these code snippets. So if you had some code you weren't comfortable sharing with the language model, just don't click the Ask Copilot button. But in this case, I'm fine sharing this. And so I now get some additional detail from Copilot chat about how to move forward. It's saying, yep, you need to go use one of these clouds queue solutions. And then it gives me some next steps. Here's how I install the NuGet package I'm going to need to interact with Azure Storage Queues. Here's an example of the C# code I need in order to do the client-side queuing operations. And then it gives me some additional guidance. And the real value here isn't just this help that I'm getting. The real value, in my opinion, is the fact that I can now have a conversation and ask follow-up questions. Maybe I'm new to Azure. I don't understand how I even go and create these resources. So I can say, how do I create an Azure Queue storage resource? And Copilot chat now will be able to walk me through that if it's something new to me. It's saying, okay, go out to the Azure portal. You're going to need to create a storage account. After you create the storage account, let's see what comes next. It's telling me how to choose the different options that I'm going to. Here's how I need to think about these different things I need to select when I create my storage account. Then I create the queue inside the storage account. I get the connection string. That's what, and so on. So it walks me through this in case it's something that I'm not familiar with. You also can have it give you more details on what it's recommending. I can say, you suggested either storage queues or service bus. How do I choose between them? And it's going to now help me understand what the important factors to consider are when deciding between these two different types of queuing services in Azure. And so I find this to be a super useful way of taking next steps after you've sort of gone through your report and gotten the lay of the land.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through the evolution. When chatbots first came out, they were really annoying to me because they weren't very helpful. They would kind of pop up. It was like Clippy. But this is a case where it's like, I want to be able to ask dumb questions. And a lot of the time when I'm choosing different services or like, I'm doing this all the time in Copilot where I'll say like, I don't understand what you just said, or is it,
right.
Is there a security problem here? Or, how do I figure out, like asking dumb questions and not feeling dumb because you're just asking a machine. So.
Yep. Or you're just asking it for an example, like in code, like, hey, what does the code look like for that? And then it gives you the code. Cool. Yeah. Super useful. Wow. So the only other things I wanted to point out here before we move on and show some of the other cool features, we do have the ability inside of the report to track the state of the different issues because they all begin as active. But as you work through this, you might want to mark some of these as already addressed so you don't need to come back to them. So let's say I used Copilot's help and I replaced my MSMQ dependency with using Azure Service Bus. I could come in here, I could mark this as resolved, or I could just mark both of these as resolved all at once here.
Mm.
And as you make changes to this report, you can save the report to disk so that now you can come back to it later and resume your investigation. We also have the ability to mark things as not applicable. So let's say, for example, let me find one that is not applicable. Here it says we're reading a file from disk. And again, this could matter if I'm reading it from a network file share or from someplace outside of my application route that wouldn't be available when I deploy to Azure App Service. In this case, all I'm doing, if I look at my source code here, is I am reading the bytes from a file which exists in the PIX directory of my application. So this is going to work just fine. I can read my own files. That's not going to be a problem. So after I look at that and say, oh, yeah, okay, I see what's going on, I can mark this as not applicable, save the file. Now, when I come back to this, I'll see it's already been reviewed. Don't need to worry about it.
Okay.
If you need to share these reports, you could, of course, share the VS report, but an easy way to share with someone who maybe doesn't have the extension is that we have the export option here. You can export the report as CSV, JSON, which is going to be the machine readable option, or as HTML. And HTML is going to give you the nicest looking one. When you export as HTML, you get a new report, which, here it is basically the exact same thing we had inside of the Visual Studio extension, but now it's in a HTML page that can easily be shared over email with your colleagues, whatever. We include all of the same information, all of the same dashboards, and we even preserve, in situations where we've updated the state of an issue, that gets propagated here as well. The only things you're missing, you can't update the state here. It's just a snapshot. And of course, we don't have the Copilot chat integration here because that requires the VS Copilot chat extension. But you still get all of the same AppCAT report information that's easily shared from this HTML page.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the basic workflow. Now, I do want to briefly show off also one of the new features that I'm really excited about, which is the ability to customize how this works. So actually, let me open back up the report and let me show you some of the things in the report. So if I open up this report we were just looking at, there are obviously all of these issues that come in box with AppCAT and many more which didn't trigger. But let's say you need to adjust these. Let's say that you don't think that for your use case, this is the right severity. It says here that local 0009 is a potential issue. Maybe I really want to know if I'm P invoking. So I would like it to be called mandatory. Well, you can use a custom config file to adjust things like the severity of these rules. You also can use it to turn them off and on. Maybe I know, oh yeah, I don't need to worry about local 0006 because I have a lot of outgoing, HTTP requests to all sorts of different URLs, but I already know they're all available from the cloud. So I just want to disable this rule entirely. You can do that. You also have the option to go in and create your own rules. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. As we go through, I guess I could have just gone back to the beginning there, but as we go through this process of creating an AppCAT report, once we get to this page, we can select a JSON config file. So I've got one here as an example. I'm going to walk through some of the interesting parts of it. The first section that's interesting is this settings binaries, this binaries section. So I haven't shown binary analysis yet. If we get 5 minutes, I'll show that as well. But if you know that there's only certain binaries in your application that you care to scan, but not all of them, you can use this section of the config file to sort of include or exclude different DLLs and exes so that you focus just on the ones that you want. So that's kind of what this part's for up here. If we scroll down, we also have a rules section. The rules section now is where I was talking about you can adjust how the rules inside of the AppCAT for .NET tool work. Here, I've called out local 006. This was that hard-coded URL one. And I've just said, no, let's disable it. I don't want to see that one anymore. And the local 0009 that I said, boy, it sure would be nice if that was mandatory instead of potential. I can say I want the severity to be mandatory. I even can add a new rule ID that doesn't yet exist. And the format here is you put the category, dot, and then the ID. So there's going to be a new category of rule called custom category, and it has a rule in it called my rule 01. I give it a label, which is what's going to show up sort of at a high level in the report. It's going to say, oh, eShopLegacy.models namespace is being used. I want to know if I'm using some particular namespace in my own code. Then you have the description, which is the more verbose explanation of what's happening. In this case, it just says, this custom rule checks for the use of the eShop Legacy MVC models namespace. And then you assign a severity for it and a number of story points. Coming down, then we have
question.
Oh, yeah,
Question
absolutely.
Here. How did you? So this is a big JSON file.
Yep.
How do I need to write this all by hand? Can I export the default one and tweak it? Like, how do I do this?
Right. So right now you need to write it by hand, but we are working on that. So this JSON file actually follows the same schema that our rules do internally. And so we're working on making examples of what this looks like available that you could copy and use as a quick start.
Cool.
We don't have that yet, but over the next couple of weeks, we're going to work on publishing, these config files that you could use as a starting point.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah. Then the final section here is the analyzers. This is the explanation of what the rules actually do. So in this case, I'm saying for my custom rule 01, I'm going to have an analyzer that's called my rule 01 namespaces. And each analyzer has a different kind. And the kind is the sort of thing that we're looking for. So I'm going to say namespace because I'm looking for a namespace. You also could have a kind like type, member, XML, JSON. And those are going to be different kinds of patterns and items that you're looking for inside of your solution. Each kind will have a different property bag that you can specify. In the case of the namespace kind, the only property we need is a list of namespaces to identify. So I list eShop Legacy MVC.models. And now, because this is kind namespace, we know that when we run, we're going to be using Roslyn to go and look through my source code for the namespaces that are listed in this set of properties. And again, we will have documentation on all of the different kinds and the properties that go with them, all of that. Not available yet, but it is in the works and should be available very soon so that you can go and create whatever rules you need that are pertinent to your specific scenarios. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to find my AppCAT config.json. This is the file we were just looking at. I'm going to analyze. Okay, so it's similar looking report. But if we go into aggregate issues, there's no longer any local 0006. I've turned that one off. Local 0009 is now mandatory.
Nice.
What's more, up at the top, we have a new one, custom category.myrule01. And it turns out it happens a lot. Turns out I refer to the eShop Legacy MVC models namespace a whole lot. Maybe I should have chosen
a lot of story
points. But yeah, a whole lot of story points. Like, oh man, you're using that namespace everywhere. But if I cared where that namespace was being used, I can go through and now I've got a list of all the places. Let's just pick one here at random. Here it is, catalog item. Catalog item is in the eShop Legacy MVC models namespace. So line 118 in this controller is identified as violating that rule, and it's identified here for me. So that's the way you can sort of customize the way this tool works.
Wow.
Yeah, I guess the last piece to demo is that we do have the command line option as well. So again, I like the Visual Studio extension as sort of the best experience because you get the Copilot integration. You get the ability to kind of mark issues as resolved or not applicable. But there are times when you want to run it from the command line. Maybe you want to automatically run it over 5 different solutions, and you don't want to do them all manually in the IDE. Well, then the CLI is a good option. Also, the CLI does have one very cool feature coming out this week, which isn't available in Visual Studio. So I'm going to show that. The tool, like I said, is a .NET SDK tool. So you install it like all .NET SDK tools by just saying .NET tool install -G to install it globally. And the package name is .NET-AppCAT. Once you've installed that, you run it very easily. You just run AppCAT analyze. That's the command that you run. The one cool feature that's only available from the command line, though, you're going to see in a minute here once the tool starts up. And it's this. It asks whether I want to analyze source code, or when you're using the CLI, you can choose to directly analyze binary output. So when
Wow.
you're inside of Visual Studio, it's assumed that you're working with the solution that's open inside of the IDE. But when you run from the command line, you have the option to just point the tool at a folder full of binaries. So this might be your build output, might be your published application, might just be a folder where you dropped in whichever DLLs you cared about. And I can come down here, I can select folder, and now I'm going to have the option to assess just that particular folder. We also can choose IIS server. If you run
That
the
one got my
AppCat,
attention. Yeah,
yeah,
that was, that was interesting.
yeah. So if you've already got your apps deployed and running on premise, you can run the AppCat tool on an IIS server. And when I choose this option, it's going to list all of the websites that are deployed in IIS on this machine. I choose which ones I care about, or I say all of them, and it's going to assess those binaries. So I can directly assess what's deployed in IIS.
Wow.
You do want to be a little bit careful with these two. This is going to assess all of the binaries unless you have a
Mhm.
config file that narrows in on particular ones. And so you do get a little bit of noise here. Like it's going to look at all of my log4net NuGet packages. It's going to look at, all of, whatever
Mhm.
binaries I have. And so you just need to sort of reason about, okay, wait, this is mine, this isn't. It's a little bit noisier than doing the source, just
Mhm.
because when you assess the binaries, there's no easy way for the tool to know which binaries belong to the developer and which ones are third party. But again, because we have the option to use those config files, you could use the config file as a way to sort of specify which ones in particular you want to look at. So if we run this here, I think I've got in my notes where I built that app to. Let me just copy this real quick. We're going to tell it we want to assess the bin folder in that same eShop legacy
Mhm.
solution. We do have the option to include a config file here if we wanted to, the same as we can from VS. And then we choose which report format we want, CSV, HTML, or JSON, same as before. And then we give the report name. Now, the default behavior is that this sort of happens interactively to make it easy to use, but there are command line options so that you can specify all of these things up front if you wanted to run this in a completely autonomous way and not have any sort of interaction.
That was my next
That's an
question.
option.
That could
Yep.
be neat to automate and have like a daily
Yes.
report or
Yeah,
something.
you could automate it. You can have it be part of your build pipeline or whatever,
Mhm.
and sort of report, hey, here's how we're trending in our AppCat report or
Yeah.
whatever. And then
Wow.
we get a report here. It popped up on my other screen. Same sort of report as before. The one thing that's a little bit different here is you're going to see there's a lot more issues because if I go into the folders, we scan to the bin folder.
Oh.
If I go to components, components no longer are classes. Components are going to be specific binaries. So it's
Mhm.
going to be my eShop legacy MVC DLL. So this is where we're going to find most of the same issues that we saw in the previous report. Here's the MSMQ usage that we saw previously. But we also have components like log4net. And this is where I talk about it's a little bit noisy. If I look at this, there's a lot of it. SMTP connections. Well, it turns out log4net has an SMTP appender where it can log issues by sending an email. Well,
Uh,
that's not going to work out of the box in app service, but I also know that my app is not using the SMTP appender, so I can ignore, a lot of this. You do get a little bit of noise this way, but hey, if you've got stuff already deployed in IIS and you want a quick way to assess it,
mhm.
this solves that for you.
Wow.
So, yeah,
That's cool.
yeah,
Um,
that's
uh,
the yeah.
okay,
More
I had a
questions? Yeah, absolutely.
question for you. So there's some in the chat, and please, as you're watching, ask your questions. But
Yeah.
what I'm curious about is incremental migration. So,
Okay.
like you showed as you were going through and marking some of them, like NA,
Yep.
I've resolved this. Just like high level. h- I mean, because I know you also work with customers that are
Yes.
doing this sort of thing. Do people just like work through and move their dependencies, or how do you what are patterns for doing that where you
Yeah.
can kind of incrementally migrate?
Yeah, that one can be a little bit tricky. When you're upgrading from like ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core, we have incremental upgrade tooling,
Hmm.
which allows you to do sort of what you're describing. When you're migrating, though, it's really tricky because you sort of need to migrate, at the scope of an application, because there's going to be something that gets deployed into app service, AKS, at the end of the day. And so at that level, you need to move things together. Um, the tooling, though, can sort of help you figure out what's involved there. You can run an AppCat report on a few different projects, try to figure out which ones may be the low-hanging fruit, which one you want to start with. But you do need to think about it in terms of at the application level,
Okay.
doing that sort of migration.
I mean, I could see maybe like a queue service moving to queue service from MSMQ to Azure
Sure.
Queue
Oh,
or
yeah,
something.
that's a good point. So to complete the migration, it's sort of at the application level, but you're right. There are individual dependencies where you might be able to say, hey, look, we're depending on this MSMQ queue. We're depending on this database. In fact, an easy one is network file shares. Just a quick
Yeah.
plug for Azure file shares. If you create an Azure storage account and create a file share service there, that's a drop-in replacement for an SMB share that you have on premise. And I've had a couple different customers I've helped who have been surprised at just how easy that transition was. And so you're right. If you identify some of those dependencies, you can replace them even when you're running on-prem and say, okay, we're just going to use Service Bus for our queuing. And now we're that much closer to being ready to pick the app up and do the migration.
Okay. Here's one that is already looking over my head, but I'll maybe it'll make sense.
Okay.
Can I port a solution to Azure when I use WCF duplex TCP binding without compromising performance and security aspects, or do I have to think about WebSockets?
You can. It's going to limit where you can run in Azure. So one of the items that we're going to identify with AppCAT, if you run the AppCAT analysis, it's going to tell you, hey, TCP binding is not going to work out of the box in Azure App Service because App Service only exposes connections over HTTP and HTTPS ports.
Mhm.
But we have options for containerizing apps, running them in, say, Azure Kubernetes service, something like that. And you could take a WCF duplex app, drop it in there. That's going to work fine. But it is something to be mindful of that it's not going to work everywhere.
Okay.
So,
One other question here, and this is just kind of general, but I'm curious because you know all about the Azures. Uh, how can you use Azure Communication Services with email? Have you done that?
I haven't. I know that Azure Communication Services does help with email and text messaging and stuff. I've not done it myself. It's a relatively new service. It's actually one I'm really excited about because SMTP dependencies was always one of the challenging ones to address. Would have to be like,
Mhm.
well, go look at SendGrid or something. But
Yeah.
we do have Azure Communication Services now, I know, and that's where I would point a customer, but I don't have any firsthand experience to know how the details of how it works.
It's funny because I've looked at that a few times before but I haven't gotten the opportunity to
Yeah,
actually use it. But there's
same.
like I'll share like there's a quick start that looks if I get a free day sometime
Yeah,
I'll play with that. But
yeah.
yeah, the quick start's like pretty straightforward. It's like um, it's like anything with I'm not sharing my screen. That's awesome. Um, but yeah, so it's like, your standard, you get a connection string, right? And then
Mhm.
you create a client and then you're just like off to the races. So that seems like a pretty neat kind of thing. So anyways, wow, that is very cool. I love the of course the Copilot integration. That's pretty slick.
Yeah.
We're That's all the questions we had. Are there more things you'd like to show off? I think there are a few things where you're like, if we get a few minutes, it'd be neat to look
I think
at.
we covered most of them. Let's see.
Okay.
I mean, if we've got time, I'll show
We got
you
a,
what the IIS assessment looks like. You were kind of
sure,
interested in
why
that
not?
one. It's easy to show off. The one catch is I have to open up a new command prompt because that requires admin privileges to actually go
Yeah.
scan what's running inside of IIS. But having
Although
done
you
that,
could maybe use the new sudo
that's
command.
true. You probably could. I've not tried that. AppCat is a .NET SDK tool. It should run inside of like WSL and stuff, though I've not
Yeah.
tried that. The only
Okay.
requirement for AppCat is you have to have the .NET 6 SDK or newer.
Mm.
But yes, I mean that might work. I don't know. Let's go ahead and sort of show how this works though. So let's say I want to just say, look, I don't want to go track down all the source of my apps or whatever. Look, this is my web server. This is where I'm moving things from. Tell me what I need to do. I choose IIS server. It asks where I'm migrating to. Let's choose Azure Container Apps. Why not? And now here, this is just my dev machine, so I don't have a ton of stuff running on it. But the tool has discovered that I have 3 websites. I've got one called Default Website. I must have been testing out the App Service Migration Assistant because I've got a Azure, or maybe this was Azure Migrate. I was testing out other migration tools. I've got that here, and then I've got a website called Tests. So I mean, I'll pick all of these.
Wow.
And then we don't need a config file. let's, for the sake of variety, let's output to CSV this time. CSV is less pretty than HTML, but if you need a format where, hey, I just want to be able to add some columns, add notes,
Mhm.
kind of go through this, it's still a helpful one to have. So we'll sort of look at what that looks like, and then we'll just say output name will be output. Okay, do the assessment, see what happens.
Yeah, I could imagine. I mean, the JSON, but also CSV. I could imagine even using that if you needed some sort of data integration. Like I've got a
Yeah,
custom work tracking system.
exactly. Yeah. So, okay, so you can see here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to format this as a table because that's going to be a little easier. But we can see we've got, let's see, here's the different websites, the test, the default, whatever. And we can go
Mhm.
through and it's identified, if I look at the paths, it's looking at things in my config files as well as in the DLLs. Now, again, this is a binary analysis. So it's looking at
Mhm.
WebGrease DLL, which I probably
Right.
don't care about. It's looking at Antler. Nope, that's all of them. So I did not prepare a
Wow.
demo here. So I don't have anything interesting running in IIS, but if I deployed that eShop sample, we would have seen all of those same issues, the MSMQ, the databases, the whatever show up here
Yeah.
associated with the eShop DLL. And then we could come in here and you get all the
Both of
same
those bring
information.
back memories. The MVC use of WebGrease and Antler.
Yeah, that's apparently what's here. But you
Wow.
get the description, you get
Mhm.
the story points, the severity. You even get the you don't get obviously like a source line because we assessed the binary, but you do
Mhm.
get if we sort of expand this one out and make it nice and big, you do
Yeah.
get the code snippet of, hey, here's the context that we're using these different things in. So that's what
Wow.
that one looks like.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had that slide before. There's the AKAMS AppCAT, I think, is kind of the
Yeah, let
main
me
one.
toss that back up. It's got some
Okay.
resources on it. I mean, this is the place to start.
Mhm.
aka.ms/appcat. It'll take you to a landing page at learn.microsoft.com where you can choose either AppCat for Java or AppCat for .NET, and then it'll take you to the docs that explain how to install the tool, how to run the tool, everything like that. Um, Again, some of the features I showed off today, the Copilot integration, choosing a specific Azure environment, binary analysis, and the config file, those are the features that are being added in our new version of AppCat that's releasing this week, hopefully Wednesday-ish. So if you install AppCat today, start playing with it. Make sure you go and you update the extension or you update the tool later this week to get all of the new functionality. And then,
Okay,
yeah, yep.
awesome. Well, there's only one last question, but I think it is a difficult question we need to dig
Oh boy.
into. Why are there no books on this one?
Yes,
Did you
that's a
just
great question.
read
So
all the books, or
that's a good question. I used to have lots of books back there. If you go watch old videos, we are moving
yeah?
at the end of the month. So
Oh, okay.
I we're going to be moving end of March, and I own way too many books, and so I have to start now if I want to get them packed up. So all of the books are over there in boxes,
Gotcha.
ready to
Okay.
be moved.
All right. That's a good answer. All
Yeah,
right.
have me
Well,
back on next month, John, and you can see the books on a new bookshelf in a new house, and then everyone will feel like they got some resolution there.
awesome. Okay. Well, this is great information. I like. I honestly wish I had some legacy apps to migrate because this looks like a lot of
And
fun.
just quick call out. It doesn't have to be legacy. You might have
Oh,
an ASP.NET Core app built on .NET 8 or like .NET 9 Preview 1 or something that you just happen to have developed and run on-prem. And now you're thinking, well, what's it look like in AKS? This can still help you understand if you've taken some sort of dependency that you're going to need to update.
that's a great reminder. I kind of mixed together the upgrade assistant and AppCat
Yeah.
in my brain, and I need to not do that because this is,
Yeah.
like you're saying, this could be a brand new application, and I'm assessing moving to Azure and what are the opportunities there.
Yeah.
Here, let me see one more question here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, if I use AppCat to analyze external apps, this is not going to be a tool to exploit dependency vulnerabilities.
Sure. So I can speak a little bit. So AppCat is not meant to be a security scanning tool. It has
Mm,
like one or two rules that we'll notice if you have like an obsolete hashing algorithm. Like if we see you using MD5, we'll be like, hey, you should probably use like
mm,
SHA-256. But it is not meant to find security issues. So AppCAT coming back and saying everything's great does not mean your app's secure. And it is unlikely to find much interesting on the security front, scanning either your own or someone else's app. Its primary purpose is to look at your C# source, your config files, or your IL in compiled binaries to identify places where you have dependencies that might impact your ability to run in an Azure PaaS environment.
Okay. I do know there are some Azure services I've noticed more. There are some things, right, where it'll scan in Azure, it'll scan
Yes.
and notice things that are
Yeah, those
potential.
are out there. And so, yeah, I mean, if you wanted to detect vulnerabilities, there are tools that specifically do that, and they're going to be a better fit than
Okay.
AppCat.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a great place to wrap up. So thank you so much, Mike, and definitely as this continues to evolve and new features, it'd be great to have you back on
Yeah,
and keep showing it off. So
absolutely. Be happy. Yep.
awesome. Okay. All right. Thanks a bunch.
All right. Thanks, John.